Hello out there in Radioland. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast, the podcast where nothing could possibly go wrong. Well, here we are in Mark Lesson 46. It sounds like a lot when you say it out loud like that. Mark Lesson 46. That means we've been doing this for, almost a year. Man. Anyway, here in Mark Lesson 46, we are still making our way through chapter 7. And if you're keeping score at home, the Pharisees have accosted Jesus because his disciples were eating with unwashed hands. And in Mark chapter 7, Jesus responds by pointing out that A, there is no actual law against that, and B, they were doing things that were far, far worse. As it turns out, they were defrauding their elderly parents via a income shelter scheme called Corban, and we talked about that. So we're going to start here in verse 14, where the Bible says, and when he called all the people unto him, he said unto them, Hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. If any man have ears to hear, let him hear. Now, dear listener, I have a real dilemma. It would be so easy to just breeze through this passage and wind up on the glorious spiritual and devotional aspects of the text of what Jesus is saying, and we'll get there. But first, I have a real dilemma because here at the Street Preacher's Corner podcast, not only do we mispronounce words all the time, but we also take a long, hard look at the scriptures and we fixate on individual words. Because we believe that every word that is in front of us is the word we're supposed to have in the language we're supposed to have it in. And if I didn't believe that, I could pull some little sleight of hand shenanigans, and I could say, I could appeal to the Greek, I could appeal to the Hebrew, I could appeal to the Septuagint, I could quote a church father, but we don't do any of that around here, as you may have noticed. We tell you what the English says, and we deal with texts from the English point of view. So here in this English text, here I have on the page in front of me the very words of Jesus Christ, preserved for me in English, and he says this, that nothing from without can defile a man. So on one hand of my equation here, I have Jesus Christ saying nothing from without can defile a man. On the other hand, I've got a couple of dozen or more Old Testament verses that say, don't do this or you'll be defiled, or don't touch that or you'll be defiled, or don't go there or you'll be defiled. Like I said, I could just blow through that and focus on the second half of what Jesus said, but that's not the kind of game we play around here. So I have to stare at this, and by the time you hear this, I'll have been staring at this for some time now. For weeks, I've been working my way through this 3 verses in Mark 7. So by the time you hear this, I will have been staring at this for some time, and I only hope that you will stare with me for a little while. Now, Noah Webster defines defile as a verb that means to make unclean, to make impure, to soil or sully, to tarnish. And using the high-tech method of ink, lined notebook paper, and a concordance, I found and wrote out and categorized every single time the word defile or one of its derivatives, defiled, defileth, defiling, any of the derivatives off the word, every time that word or one of its derivatives showed up, I took a ink pen and notebook paper and wrote that verse out and just looked at it in context and thought about it, and here we are. So then I took and I plugged Webster's definition into every one of those instances, and I found that it held up, so that's good. And I could prove it to you by going through every verse, but it would make you like me even less, and some of you aren't too crazy about me to begin with. But a foundational principle here at the Street Preacher's Corner is that when it comes to difficult Bible passages, the best way, sometimes the only way out, is through. So with that in mind, we have to talk about this dilemma I have. Like I said, on one hand, I have Jesus saying, nothing from without can defile you. And then on the other hand, I have probably a dozen or more Old Testament passages where people are getting defiled by external things. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do with this, right? So Jesus said that nothing from without can defile a man, and yet we appear to have oodles and oodles of examples of that very thing happening. Now, sometimes it's idolatry, like in Leviticus 20 or Ezekiel 20 or Jeremiah 3 or Jeremiah 19. Sometimes it's contact with dead bodies, like in Numbers 9 or Numbers 19. Sometimes the land itself is defiled by sin, like in Ezekiel 36. Sometimes it's defilement due to blood and lies, which is the case in Isaiah 59. And so I went through all this, and I just beat my head against the wall in every way but literally. And after beating my head against the wall for a while, I decided to look at exactly what Jesus said and see if I can narrow the scope a little bit. The context here is Mark 7, 1 through 5. And the thing, Christ's response is in verse 6. And then his explanation of what he just said is in verse 14 and 15, which we've already read. So he lays another interesting thing here is he lays out his explanation based on the heart condition of the person listening or reading. If any man have ears to hear, let him hear. Well, everybody standing there has ears. So, there's ears and then there's ears. I mean, after all, sometimes you can hear without hearing. Know what I mean, Jelly Bean? So verse 14, I'll read this again. And when he called on the people unto him and said to them, hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. So the thing he's about to explain is for everybody, and it is being done as a response to the Pharisees. So we're going to take verse 15, and we're going to break it into two parts, and we're going to address those separately. Okay? And we'll get to as much of this as we get to. So the beginning of verse 15 says, there is nothing from without a man. So that's external, outside of a man. There's nothing from without a man that enter into him can defile him. Now, that is a very narrow statement. And if you compare it to any sort of Old Testament lists of things that can defile you, you find things like wizardry and idolatry and adultery, or offering your kids to Moloch. So, dumb question time. So, like I said, we're going to start with the basic, and we're going to work our way in to the nut, to the heart of the matter. That's what we do around here, right? So, dumb question time. In light of Jesus' statement, and in light of this list that we could produce out of the Old Testament, in light of Jesus' statement, do you swallow idolatry? Because what he said is, there is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. Okay? So, and the reference is the fact that they're eating food. Okay, so that's the context. So can you eat idolatry? Can you swallow idolatry? Can you swallow adultery? Can you swallow wizardry? You probably shouldn't, because you wouldn't want to get one of those pointy hats stuck in your throat. But nothing you can put in your mouth and swallow can defile you. If you take that Old Testament list and you lay that thing out, you'll find those are all external things. None of those are things that you sit down and eat. None of those are things that you swallow. So in other words, nothing you can put in your mouth can swallow can defile you. And the things that can defile you can't be swallowed. Yes, I see you with your hand up in the back of the internet. We will talk about Leviticus 22 and we will talk about Daniel 1, but we have to do this one thing at a time. So there are some things that defile you that are a little bit unavoidable. And so God has made provision for that. He's able to maintain his holiness while working with a group of people that have a hard time staying out of trouble. But an example of something that may defile you that's a little bit unavoidable. Let's say a member of your family dies and somebody has to deal with the body. I mean, you can't just leave it in the living room after all. And then whoever deals with that body, whoever picks it up and carries it, whoever moves it, whoever embalms it, that person for a period of time is defiled by that dead body. If you've ever been around a dead body for very long, you know exactly why. And in stuff like that, and I'm using dead bodies as an example because there's multiple passages about it. In stuff like that, you are only you're only dirty. I say duty bound. You're only dirty until you get clean. So sometimes that involves washing. Sometimes that involves just the passage of time. A lot of these issues that you get defiled by something, you are unclean until the sun goes down. You're unclean until even. So in the unfortunate consequences of living in a world ruled by death, God has made provision, and it's not an unreasonable provision. Now, the Bible doesn't say what the disciples were eating. I keep saying it was sandwiches, but that's because I'm an American. But whatever they're eating, it was allowed, right? I mean, can we agree on that? They were not eating something that was forbidden under Levitical law. I mean, there's no pulled pork sandwiches there. There's no shrimp po' boys there. They're saying they're eating in front of Jesus, and presumably Jesus is eating too, because Jesus has to eat in a human body. So Jesus is standing right there. So the food in front of them is okay, because if it wasn't, Jesus wouldn't be anywhere near it. And the hand washing isn't a requirement, so that's okay. There is literally, if you look at this whole scenario, there is literally no problem here. And as the old saying goes, don't start no trouble, and there won't be no trouble. But the Pharisees have come along and started trouble. But I think it's fair in light of that. In fact, in light of the fact this was such a big deal to them, and there's lots of reasons why they wanted something to hang around Jesus' neck so they could discredit him, so they could then disregard him in front of the people. Whenever they did these little shows in front of Jesus, whenever they did these little confrontations in front of Jesus, it was always in front of a group of people, because the goal was to discredit him, after all. But I think it's fair to ask, what straws exactly were these guys grasping at? What did they think was going on? What did they think? Well, maybe we can get him on a technicality on this. Maybe get him on a technicality on that. So we're going to now we're going to look. We're going to talk about Leviticus 22 and Daniel 1, and maybe we'll take a drive by Acts 10 while we're at it. Who knows? So Leviticus 22. I'm going to go ahead and turn there. So I got got the verses actually in front of me. Leviticus 22. The Bible's laying out the context of Leviticus 22 is the Bible's laying out the structure of priestly provision. Now, some of you guys know this already, some of you don't, so just be patient with me either way. So there are 12 tribes in Israel, and those 12 tribes, out of those 12 tribes, 11 of them have land allotted to them. So if you lived in Judah, you would, in theory, live with all the other Judah people. If you were Gad, you'd live where all the Gad people live. You live Dan. You get what I'm saying? Well, there was one tribe that had no land. Now, if you have land, you can plant crops, you can raise cattle, you can provide food for your family. But Levi, his descendants, had no land. Actually, the Bible says that God is their inheritance. And so God required Israel to feed Levi. Levi ate of the tithes and offerings, and Levi ate the meat from the sacrificed animals. Maybe one of these days I'll go into my position on tithing, but not today. So Levi ate the tithes and offerings, Levi ate the meat from the sacrificed animals, and that is the context of Leviticus 22. God is explaining how these guys are not going to starve to death. But along with the not starving to death part, along with the living out of everyone else's pantry thing, there are some rules, there are some stipulations, there are some hindrances. So we're going to start at verse 4. What man soever the seed of Aaron is, that Aaron was a Levite, in case you didn't know. What man soever the seed of Aaron is a leper, or hath a running issue, he shall not eat of the holy things until he be clean. And whoso toucheth anything that is unclean by the dead, or a man whose seed goeth from him, or whosoever toucheth any creeping thing, whereby he may be made unclean, or a man of whom he may take uncleanness, whatsoever uncleanness he hath, the soul which hath touched any soul shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat of the holy things, unless he wash his flesh with water. And when the sun is down, he shall be clean, and shall afterward eat of the holy things, because it is his food. Now, verse 8 is what we're going to zero in on. That which dieth of itself, or is torn with beasts, he shall not eat, to defile himself therewith. Semicolon, I am the Lord. Okay, so, verse 9 is important too. They therefore shall keep mine ordinances, lest they bear sin for it, and die therefore if they profane it. I, the Lord, do sanctify them. Man, there's a lot in there. Okay, so here's the basic idea. A Levite could take an animal that had been led into the temple, whose throat had been slit, whose blood had been gathered, whose various parts have been offered up as burnt offering to the Lord, he could take that animal and he could take that and he could eat that and feed that to his family. That was the provisional statute. He could eat of the grains and the fruit, the first fruits that people brought into the temple. That was how a Levite fed himself, fed his family. What he could not do, if he wanted to serve God, is he couldn't come out there and find some cow laying dead on the side of the road, no idea what killed it, and just, some roadkill, lop off a piece of it and chew down. He could not do that. If he found, if some wolf or some tiger or some bear or some lion had torn a sheep apart and left some of it behind, the Levite could not eat that. You say, well, there you go. That's proof that something entering into a man can defile him. Well, hold on. So he couldn't eat roadkill, and that's the shorthand version for all the stuff I just laid out. He could not eat roadkill, and it defiled him because according to verse 9, which is why I made sure we read verse 9, according to verse 9, it was an act of disobedience for him to do that. It wasn't the thing that defiled him, it was the disobedience. And by the way, it's still, even if you're not a Levite, even if you're a 21st century American, it's still not a good idea, generally speaking, to eat roadkill. Just, that's my little diet tip for you. I mean, you got to do what you got to do, but, it's not my first choice. Have I eaten roadkill? Yes. Not my first choice. But it wasn't the thing that defiled him. It wasn't the meat that defiled him. It was the disobedience. So it was the deliberate choice to eat some dead thing that you found in the field or in a ditch, as opposed to what God had provided. If you take that same dead cow that's in the ditch, and, while it's still alive, you sacrifice it according to God's method, it would have been fine. So when you're going to say that, well, that's proof that that you could defile yourself by what you eat. No, you defiled yourself by the disobedience of eating something that God has specifically put off limits. Any other tribe of Israel could there was way more liberty of the rest of the tribes of Israel when it came to dietary things than for Levi, which tells me that the thing itself, there's nothing wrong with the thing itself that you're doing. Sometimes the only thing that's wrong with something is the fact that God said don't do it. I mean, really, that's all the reason you need. If you ever, you're a parent, you've had kids, and your kids say, well, why? And you say, because I said so. That's legit. I mean, there comes an age where you got to explain things a little bit better. But that's a legit response. That's God's response a lot of times, because I said so. So there's that. So I don't think that the Pharisees were clueless enough or crooked enough or liberal enough in their interpretation of law to where they really thought that disciples were violating Leviticus 22, because the disciples are not Levites. Jesus is not a Levite, and there's nothing to indicate that they were over there eating roadkill sandwiches with Jesus standing right there. So I don't think that's the ground they're trying to stand on. But we still had to cover it because that's what we do. So what about Daniel 1 then? Well, in Daniel 1, let me turn there. There are some books that are always hard for me to find, no matter how many times I've read them, and I've read them, let's just say more than once, and Daniel's one of them, but there you go, I found it the first time. In Daniel 1, the context in Daniel 1, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, when he had invaded Israel, he took the young, and he took the strong, and he took the capable back to Babylon with him. So see, that's why you invade a place. I don't know if anyone's ever told you this. That's why you invade a place. You invade a place so that you can plunder it and make its assets your own. You don't invade a place just because you have so that you have an excuse to build roads and schools and hospitals in another country with your citizens' tax money. I don't know if that sounds like anything that's happened in the last, 30, 40 years, but the shoe fits, wear it. So Nebuchadnezzar had brought the young and the strong and the capable back to Babylon. And I'm just going to say this. The devil has the same strategy, I suspect. I think the devil would want the strong and the young and the capable to give their strength and their youth and their capability to his service rather than God. So Nebuchadnezzar scoops up all the best people, all the people that know how to do something. He left the useless and the lazy and the crippled and the old and the infirm. He left them back in Israel and took all the good stuff and headed back to Babylon with it. So when this cream of the crop gets to Babylon, the king wants them developed and cultivated to the the fullest strength and potential for the glory of the Babylonian Empire, and that includes their diet. So that's the context of Daniel 1. Now we're going to read the verse. Daniel 1, verse 3, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So the idea is you take these people who have grown up on whatever, and you bring them to Babylon, and you feed them this special diet. Okay, so after 3 years of that special diet, you are supposed to be enhanced enough, or strong enough, or developed enough, and accustomed enough to that diet to where you can stand before the king of Babylon and serve him. That's the context. So now with that in mind, let's look at verse 8 in the same chapter, Daniel 1, verse 8. The Bible do say, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat. Where are we at? We're going to take this all the way, yeah. He would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. And so he could send to them in this matter, and prove them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. Now, what this is not is an advocacy for being a vegetarian. We bought this book one time. Eating God's Way, or Eating God's, just something like that. And this guy on there, I'm sure he meant well, but he was very much into eating raw vegetables. This was his thing. He said in the Garden of Eden, there weren't nobody cooking no vegetables. And so, look, everybody lived to be 900 years old. Well, there's more going on there than just everybody eating raw vegetables. And there's a lot going into that. There's a he said that God designed us to eat. God's original intention was for people to not eat meat, and so we shouldn't eat meat. Well, God's original intention was also for nobody to wear clothes. But there's been a revision or two to the plan since then. I mean, sin came into the world, and all of a sudden you got to cover your nakedness. And so when you get into the New Testament, you have abstaining from meats being called a doctrine of devils. So what this is, this passage in Daniel, anyway, when this guy wrote this book about why everybody should eat nothing but vegetables, this was one of the passages he cited. He said, look, Daniel ate nothing but vegetables, and Daniel became big and strong and handsome. Okay, there's a little more to it than that. And if that's all you take away from that is that a person should be a vegetarian, knock yourself out. I can take a Bible and prove that meat eating on this side of the flood is allowed, encouraged, possibly even commanded, depending on how you want to look at it. But if you want to eat vegetables, you want to eat like a rabbit, that's up to you. But this is not the passage to go to, because that's not what's going on. Okay, and I think I can claim this. I think I can establish this with Scripture. You ready? So pick up Deuteronomy 32 in one hand, and Hosea in the other. We'll start with Deuteronomy 32. Now, in Deuteronomy 32, God is comparing himself to the false pagan gods of the Canaanites, okay? And so we're in verse 30. Yeah. 31. For their rock is not as our rock, even our enemies themselves being judges. For their vine is of the vine of Sodom, and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is as the poison of dragons, and the cruel venom of asps. Is this not laid up in store with me, and sealed up among my treasures? To me belongeth vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand. And the things that shall come upon them make haste. For the Lord shall judge his people, and repent himself for his servants, when he seeth that their power is gone, and there's none shut up or left. And he shall say, Where are their gods, their rock, in whom they trusted, which did eat of the fat of their sacrifices, and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up and help you, and be your protection. So, like I said, he's comparing himself to the pagan gods of the Canaanites, and the pagan gods of the Canaanites. We can see from this passage that they had some practices that are interesting, and they are sort of mirrors of some of the things that that God had given to His people, because the devil, after all, is a counterfeiter. But we know that it was a common pagan practice to consume the meat that had been offered for sacrifices, and to consume this wine that apparently was bitter. And verse 36 and 37 tells us that these pagans saw these meats and this drink as a source of strength and protection. So get that in your head. You have a bunch of people that believe it's good for you not just to eat meat, but to eat meat that has been specifically sacrificed to their pagan gods. It is not just good for you to drink wine. You should drink this bitter wine that we make, because it's good for you. It'll make you big and strong and handsome and give you muscles like Popeye. So that's the context of all that, right? So verse Hosea 9. I used to joke that Hosea was the only Mexican fellow in the Bible. That's the sort of dumb things people say. If I had sense, I'd have found this before I told you to look at it. Hosea 9. Minor prophets, always a problem. They just, you roll right past them sometimes. Here at the Street Preacher's Corner, we are not ashamed to sometimes try to figure out where the book actually is. So in Hosea 9, God's people had taken up this practice of consuming meat, sacrificing idols, and drinking this bitter wine. They had taken up this practice. It was, the cultural appropriation of the worst kind. And God has given them what they wanted. By the way, sometimes God gives people exactly what they want as a form of judgment. You see that in the Nebuchadnezzar's conquering of Israel. Israel had been steeped in idolatry for 2-3 generations by that point, and God told them, knock it off, or I'm going to send somebody in to drag you away in chains. Oh, they're going to keep bowing down to idols, keep bowing down to idols, keep bowing down to idols. God goes, fine, I'm going to have an idolater come in. He's going to cart you off to Babylon, and you like idols so much, he's going to make you bow down to a golden image of himself. I mean, that's what you want, right? I'll let you have what you want. You see that in Romans 1, where God gives people over to a reprobate mind. He lets them follow the natural consequences of their unholy appetites. God does not have to hurt you. All God has to do is leave you alone, and you'll hurt yourself. Another sermon for another time, perhaps. In Hosea 9, so we're going to start in so we're going to start verse 1. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people, for thou hast gone a whoring from thy God. Thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. At the floor of the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. They shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat thereof shall be polluted, for their bread for their soul shall not come into the house of the Lord. What will you do in the solemn day and in the day of the feast of the Lord? For lo, they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up, Memphis shall bury them, the pleasant places for their silver. Nettles shall possess them, thorns shall be in their tabernacles. The days of visitation are come, and the days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. If the prophet is a fool, the spiritual man is mad, for the multitude of thine iniquity and the great hatred. And we'll stop there. So God says, okay, you want to do this? Go ahead. You like this stuff so much? Go ahead. I'll let you do what you want, but you're not going to hear from me. Your prophets are going to there'll be no spiritual insight from me as long as this foolishness is going on. Okay, and so they've stopped. The issue here in Hosea 9 is that these people have stopped looking to the Lord for their strength, and they have stopped looking to the Lord for protection. And so God has turned them over to gods who cannot deliver. He's turned them over to gods who cannot provide strength or protection. So you see, dear listener, our dear friend Daniel, he was making a statement. His strength wasn't going to come from Babylonian pagan practices. His strength and his health and his wisdom was going to come from the Lord God of Israel. Do you really think if Daniel had not made the stand right there that he made, do you really think God would have given him the wisdom to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream the very next chapter? You have to prepare yourself to hear from God. You have to prepare yourself to serve God. You have to prepare yourself to have discernment and not be a fool. And that's how that works. So he's making a statement. His strength and his health and his wisdom is not going to come from the Babylonians. It's going to come from the Lord God of Israel. It is the same sort of thing. I think it's comparable, maybe to a greater degree. It's the same sort of thing to a Christian refusing to wear like a good luck charm. See, Daniel's trying to be a witness for the Lord, and he's trying to prove that safety is of the Lord. It wasn't that the meat would defile him because the Babylonians ate it. It didn't defile them. There's nothing bad about the meat itself. It wasn't the meat would defile him per se. It was that the failure to look to God for strength would defile him. Putting his trust in Babylonian ways would defile him. And Dr. Peter S. Ruckman used to say that every Christian has a duty to identify the spirit of his age and walk against it. And I think Daniel personally would agree. So what is the spirit of our age right now? I'll give you a hint what I think it is. I think it happens in June. But anyway, I went through all that just so I can circle back around to Mark 7 and the second half of Jesus' statement. Okay? The second half of the statement is, but the things which come out of him, those are they which defile a man. You know something? I didn't cover Acts 10, did I? Okay, no notes. Here we go. Acts 10. Acts 10. I'll tell you a little story. So there was a wedding we went to. There was a wedding we were part of. And it was up in Tennessee, and so we get done with the wedding, and we're not quite ready to turn and come back to Georgia yet. And so we're looking for a place to eat before we hit the road. And we find this little place down there by the river, and they got this little eatery shack kind of thing. And we're in there, and we're looking at the menu, and we noticed that all the waitresses were very modestly dressed, and I appreciate that anyway. And so we're looking at the menu, and it says basically it says that they don't serve any pork products because the pig is an unclean animal, and they wanted to please God in their own life, and they don't want to contribute to you being not right with God and all that kind of stuff. So my wife, who's normally not a confrontational sort of person, that's my department, she calls the owner was out walking around talking to people, and she figured out which one was the owner. She said, I'm very curious about this. Tell me how you got there. And he said, well, it's kind of like what it says in the menu. And the menu had the verse out of Deuteronomy about, the provisions there. Or it's Leviticus 11, actually, is where that's at. But anyway, so he said, yeah, we don't serve pork. We don't serve any kind of pork products because pigs are an unclean animal. She said, you have an all-you-can-eat catfish night, though. And so if you know your Levitical law, you know that catfish are also unclean. And I guess he hadn't thought that all the way through. He meant well. But my wife said, well, what about Peter in Acts 10? She might not have said where the verse was, but what about Peter in Acts 10? Doesn't that mean that we are at liberty to eat whatever we want? So before we get to Acts 10, let me just address that issue. I think as a Gentile, we were always at liberty to eat whatever we wanted. The law that God gave to Israel, he gave to Israel. And my ancestors didn't know nothing about it. My ancestors are walking the earth at the same time that Moses was, at the same time that all stuff's going on, and my ancestors hadn't heard boo from God. Except for what Romans 1 says, the law of God written in their hearts. And you don't see any culture that with no exposure to a Bible that naturally has any laws on the dietary restrictions. It's a very general statement. I'm sure you can find an exception. But you will find there's not a society out there that thinks adultery is okay. There's not a society out there that thinks murder is okay. There's not, because there's some pretty depraved societies out there. You're living in one where all sorts of confusion is going on. But nobody thinks that treachery and villainy, no normal person thinks that. It's just you have deviants, you have bad people in your society, but nobody thinks that stuff's okay because the law of God's written in their heart. But nobody is sitting in the banks of the Mississippi River back in the day where the Mississippi Indians were living and pulling catfish out of the Mississippi River going, man, I shouldn't be eating this. God's against it. Nobody was thinking that, right? So there's no Old Testament dietary laws given to Gentiles. It's just not there. He gave that stuff to Israel for a handful of reasons. One of them was to make them a peculiar people, and one was to, separate them unto himself. One was to limit their contact with the other people because he's trying to produce a godly seed. There's a lot going on there with all that. I said we're going to talk about Acts 10. This is what happens when I don't have notes. I just rattle on too much. So Acts 10, verse 9, on the morrow, as they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city, Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. And he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance. And he saw heaven opened, and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been great sheet knit at the four corners, and let down to the earth, wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Peter said, No, not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou uncommon. This was done thrice, and the vessel was received up again into heaven. Now, while Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he seen should mean, behold, the men that were sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house, and stood before the gate. And they called and asked whether Simon, which was surnamed Peter, were lodged there. While Peter thought on the vision, the Spirit said to them, Behold, 3 men seek thee. So, something you might want to, if you read this real careful, like, one of the things you'll notice is that thing comes down, and it says, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Peter never eats any of that stuff. It comes down, it folds up. It comes down, it folds up. It comes down, it folds up. And then there's a knock at the door. It comes down 3 times because there are 3 Gentiles. So in Acts 10, what you don't have is a lifting of the Old Testament dietary provisions off the church, because the Old Testament dietary provisions were never part of the church, because the Old Testament dietary provisions were a thing God gave them so they could stay in the land. God did not hold them to those provisions when they were outside the land. So if you're going to say, I can eat catfish now because of Acts 10, well, you can eat catfish now, but you could always eat catfish if you were a Gentile. You see what I'm saying? So that's not the thing. But so we have to get back to Mark 7. We have to focus in on this last little part of this thing. But the things which come out of him, this is the second part of Jesus' statement in verse 15. But the things which come out of him, those are they which defile the man. So it turns out, dear listener, that the issue when it comes to defilement is not your upbringing or your socioeconomic status. The problem isn't violent video games or racy billboards on the highway or R-rated movies. The problem is you. And the problem has always been you, and all the things that cause the problems in your life can be traced back to you. The problem is you. The problem has always been you. And Jesus proceeds to elaborate on that, and we are going to save that elaboration and all the implications of that elaboration for next time out. Well, thank you for listening, all 4 of you. This has been Michael. This has been the Street Preachers Podcast. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. And for the love of God, man, do something for Jesus Christ, because he is worthy. Risk your life for Jesus Christ sometime before you die. As Gerald Sutek says, nobody ever got a chance to die for Jesus that wasn't already living for Jesus. Thank you, and good day.